Okay, we will start, and I'm sure a few others will join us as we go along. So, as I say, welcome everybody. We are going to be meeting with two visual artists today, but before we get going, I just want to give you one or two little announcements while I also keep my eye in the waiting room about some events that are coming up. So first of all, on September 29th, we have a conversation with a poet from the Hudson Valley in New York State called Sophie Strand, who is joining us as part of our Borrowed Time strand. And Sophie will be in conversation with probably with Matt Osmond and possibly with me as well. I'm not quite sure. Sophie's a writer, fantastic writer. And if you go to the website, there's a couple of examples of her work up there that she'd really like you to read if you come to the event. And that's free, but you do need to register. So if you want to come, that's at 7 p.m. on the 29th, in order to make things a bit civilized for her. And then on October 15th, there's another event which we're calling a celebratory gathering, which is also to do with the Borrowed Time theme. And it's an invitation, it's a participatory invitation for you to come along and share memories or remembrances, which is a slightly different thing, of people or objects or plants or other species, companions, whatever. It's just a gentle and informal sharing and little celebrations of that part of your life, and that's also in the evening. So come along and find it on the website. Again, you need to register if you want to come, but it is free. And then finally, we've just announced our main event for next year, which is going to be in July. And it's called Sentient Performativities. It's all about embodiment, basically, at the end of the day. So have a look at that, which is again on the front page of the website. So great. I think I will stop rambling, but I did want to just let you know about an event coming up from Evgenia and her group, The Eternal Forest, which is coming up on September 8th. And I'm sure Evgenia can put a link in the chat for that. And that's a conversation with the Forester Collective. So there's more on the website. You can click on that have a look at the chat, click on that link and go and take a look through. Just before we start, if you want to ask a question or make a comment or anything else you'd like to say, you can do that in chat. I'm just going to open that so I've got it there. I will try to keep an eye on that and relay any questions or ask you to come in and ask a question or whatever after each of the speakers is finished. So I'm going to first of all introduce Wang Preston, who is coming to us today. Well, she'll tell us where she's coming from. Again, both of the invited artists today are visual artists, so I'm going to just simply hand over to Jan and let her introduce herself and her work. Say, do use the chat window to give us any comments or ask any questions. So Jan, over to you.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Richard. It's great to be here today. Because I've been dying for some real creative conversations. So Richard said it might be a good idea to tell people where I am. I'm in West Yorkshire in the UK, kind of in between Manchester and Leeds. I'm in my studio. It's It's quite nice and big, but it's freezing. I don't know what that is, but it is freezing. I think it makes me healthy. With today's talk, I'm going to kind of have a reflection, like a review of what I've done in the last 15 months or so. And really, this is not a formal presentation. I'm really in need of your feedback, suggestions, guesses. So, that's why I'm here. So please feel, very open and brave if you think the work's not quite there. Well, that's for sure. It's not quite there because it's new. So I'm going to start my presentation. Okay, so you can all see that, can you? Great.
Yes, we can see it fine.
Okay. So the presentation is called "With Love from an Invader." It's a title for a piece. I think it's more or less made since last year. But before we get into that, I'll just spend a couple of minutes telling you, what I do. I'm primarily a photographer. My interest is really in landscape representation and how it's related to national and personal identities. And within that, obviously, our relationship to all our position within nature are also a big part of that. This is a picture when I was doing my Mother River project. This was like up in on the Tibetan plateau, very cold with thin air. So I think my artistic career really formally started when I decided to do the Mother River project. That was a project very easy to describe. Basically, I photographed the entire 6,211 kilometer Yangtze River in China, every 100 kilometers. And all of the information can be found on my website. So just a few pictures to show you, it's a project that's conceptual, that's physical, that's documentary, but also, for me, it's more landscape orientated, because I say this because some people think it's a documentary project because of the very precise locations. But you do get to see the entire China, more or less, from Tibet, travel down on the river, and, within the Three Gorges, some historical sites near Shanghai, when industry along the river is flourishing, and to the sea. I published a book for the project, and I've had many exhibitions with it too. I kind of parallel to that, I also did a project called Forest. It's much more environmentally rooted. The project is really, I think it is to explore the complexities of the construction of natural environment in urban spaces. That sounds quite abstract. I basically photographed transplanted old trees. So, when a Chinese city wants to have a forest, sometimes they don't want to wait. They basically buy and transplant oak trees directly into their urban environment. So I think for 8 years, I followed the development of certain trees at certain sites, and also followed the development of the city. I think I had a changed perspective, because at first I really saw the city and the trees were enemies. Well, the city was enemy to the trees, but in the end I realized, for pictures like this, I realized there is a chance, nature is strong, we are strong. The city is made of concrete, but life can happen, even if it happens with quite a brutal beginning of displacement. with that, the ecology recovery projects that were happening a lot in China, when green becomes literally the box to tick. It doesn't matter about the material. This quarry is literally covered by green plastic netting. So again, with forest is a lot less conceptual. I would say it's a storytelling project. I also published a book and had quite a lot of exhibitions with it. So that already took me to about 2018. I had a couple of years of quite intense period of, showing the work, promoting the work of both projects. At the same time, I also kind of really wanted to to do something in England for many reasons, personal reasons. My daughter's age, she's like 6, so she needs me here. And I think the way of working, particularly with Mother River, and so much petrol burned. Ethically, I wouldn't want to do that again. To work in England is really difficult for me, has been, I think, ever since I got here 16 years ago. I found it a fascinating place, but my relationship to it is quite difficult to pin down. And that means the work is always difficult somehow. And the scale, the color palette, everything is different from what I was used to. But with the pandemic last year, I thought, well, this is a perfect opportunity to actually really root myself here and see what can happen. So Boris Johnson, the British Prime Minister, he announced, I think on the 16th of March last year, that he asked everyone if they could to stay at home. And I think he used the word lockdown, after a week, but this was the day, the 16th of March, he asked for us to do that. I immediately made a decision. I thought, okay, it looks like I'm not going anywhere for some time. And there's a site I was fascinated by for a long time, and I'm just going to go there. I already found one rhododendron bush I would like to work with, because the site itself is called Shedden Clough, a very remote, little known area in between Lancashire and Yorkshire in the UK, quite deep inland. It's an industrial site. I think it was mined for lime 400 years ago and left as a total mess as an open cast mining area. And then about 150 years ago, the landowner decided to turn the wasteland into a hunting estate. So they planted a lot of rhododendrons. The rhododendrons have thrived, but now the rhododendrons are seen as invasive species, threatening the British ecology and landscape and national identity. I am from China. I have a personal connection with the rhododendron. The sight of them makes me feel more at home here. And the thing about, the two words are always linked, invasive and non-native. From an ecological point of view, these two things are not associated, but often they are in the media and also, in many ecological papers. I am a foreigner, and somehow that it always rings alarm in my mind, invasive and non-native. I had already been looking at the site for a year. I took various really bad pictures, and I thought, okay, it seems like there's one thing I can do now is to keep going at it. Yes, let's take more bad pictures until they get better, hopefully. So 17th of March, first day when we were asked to stay at home, I started my 1-year engagement with the site, with this particular rhododendron, because it happens to have a shape of a heart. And my daughter said, "Mommy, it looks like a love heart." So now it happens to have a shape of a love heart. I thought that's such an interesting metaphor, you know, a love heart made by an invasive species. So I made a plan for a whole year, 365 days. I'd walk to the site every other day because I realized every day would not be possible just from practical reasons. Every other day, always half an hour. I will photograph the same bush from the same angle, always at half an hour before sunset. Because so much of my work is always founded on a very intense embodied research within the landscape. You know, it's not just the eyes. I find the sight is so limited. You know, it's all the senses. It's your feelings and emotions when you are placed in the actual environment that always gave me insight that I probably could not gain from other channels. So I thought, okay, I'll do this 4 seasons, 365 days. And this was the very first picture I made last March. It was really, really windy and dark. I remember sitting in the car park. It's a 17-minute drive from my house and a 22-minute walk. You know, listening to Boris Johnson talking about the pandemic. And then in June that year, the love heart blossomed. The entire flowering season is about two months each year. So this last year it didn't do very well. The year before it had a lot more flowers. So this was kind of the peak day. And by the way, each day is different. They never stay still. Then you go into autumn when you think, oh, nothing really is happening. Why am I still going? But that's the point. I'm still going. And you know, we had a very snowy winter, which made the pictures perhaps more interesting if you think being dramatic is interesting. I learned so much from the 182 walks because really taking the picture became almost an automatic thing. It was not very difficult. But it's all the information that I collected on my way, either from my own bodily senses or from other means. From hearing, I found the sound was so important. I always found sound very important in the landscape because it operates in a very different way and it can't quite be filtered out as how sight can be. So one thing I did was at the very beginning of the project, I asked a composer to work with me. We now are making a time lapse as a core of, I think it will be a multi-channel audio-visual installation, but with a time lapse as a core and the soundscape. So we can just listen to about a couple of minutes of it. Sorry. So this is going to be very slow and very long, about 36 minutes, 24 seconds. We used entirely the ambient recording we made on the site. I think Monty, my collaborator, just added one piece of string to link it all together. For me, this is fairly straightforward. In the exhibition setting, I'm hoping this can be a meditative space for visitors to sit there and just to really think back, perhaps, the very spectacular year. But there's something else. I think one thing I really found fascinating was the site. Originally, I thought it was a wasteland. It is seen as an ecological wasteland, colonized by invasive species and by grazing grass. But what I actually found was the site was so full of life. For example, so I placed infrared, very cheap infrared motion sensitive camera all over the place in the area, and I realized it was always very, very busy with all sorts of large and small and micro creatures. They know exactly where we are, we just don't know where they are. And this is really profound, because this really made me realize the site is a shared homeland, shared by all of us, not just me, other people and these animals and birds. I think that was something that led me to consider, I was just reading this book by John Taylor. It's called A Dream of England. And in the last chapter, he talked about wasteland, almost like a land of resistance. He talked about the fact that at least in art, you have this binary. One side is landscape, the other side is wasteland, and they don't really come together. And I think I've talked to quite a lot of ecologists and cultural geographers. I realized that the wasteland is really a land of opportunities. This particular site, because it's not fully managed, and nature, a cosmopolitan nature, can and have had a chance to develop itself into, an ecological system. And so my question at this stage is, how do I talk about it? How do I talk about this wasteland as a land of opportunity? For example, from the angle of landscape imagery. And let's look at this is a screen grab for, one of the fox footage. And how do we, if we put a wild animal in the picture, it always immediately it transforms everything into, oh my God, this is wilderness, wildlife, wildlife. And how can we do this without romanticizing it? Or, I try to make this picture, basically took some pictures of very, very vernacular views, but these was the site that I'd seen wild animals. And how can a view like this have significance, or how can it have it? So these are my questions. I need to think quite, I tried this, that's not quite working. So now, I'm thinking about landscape image makers who develop a new language. I know I'm, already approaching the limit of time. I'll try to go quite fast here. So landscape image makers who already, tested new ways of, changing this kind of urban view into a landscape, or, a war ruin into a landscape, or perhaps, this kind of aesthetic of a vernacular snapshot quality, or perhaps even Jeff Wolf, this kind of almost like a documentary, but it's a constructed documentary. So I'm looking at these people's work and to see if there's something for me to try to crack this in a way. And I think that's kind of quite an academic question. But on the personal side, I found myself unable to make pictures, a straight picture from the landscape here. So I tried from other angles. I know Junko, my friend and collaborator, powerful Ikebana artist, is in the audience. We made some Ikebana and photographed them using weeds, wild flowers, and invasive species, rhododendron. I put that flag there just to remind myself what I'm doing. And I also tried to even let go of the very formal Ikebana and try to somehow use this kind of Chinese traditional aesthetic of the still life, flower and bird paintings. This is with Spanish bluebell and bamboo. And with landscape image, again, I said I cannot do what I did before. I found myself again and again trying to make landscape pictures in Yorkshire with this quiet Chinese aesthetic. These are a few test images. And so I realized perhaps my position really is a foreigner. On this personal side, these flower pictures, if I give them a working title, English gardens with all these foreign plants, are portrayed in a foreign way. And the English landscape are also portrayed in a Chinese way. Perhaps that's my crying, my longing, my searching for that kind of landscape here. And finally, within that, migrations obviously in connecting the invasive species, pests. And just to finish off, a few days ago, I made another piece, which I think is quite a radical departure from the work I made before. With the consideration of migration, I thought about cultural migration. I thought about what happens if you put one thing that's made in a very specific context into another context. So to make this thing is not like the purpose, but to try to open up this kind of consideration and discussion. So I thought about repeating other iconic works here. And so this photograph is called To Add a Meter to an Anonymous Mountain, created in 1995 by a group of 12 Chinese artists. They were 10 in the photo, they piled their naked bodies together on top of a little hill outside of Beijing. So on the 18th of August, You'll be happy to know that apart from myself, I have two very close friends who are curators. They've seen that, and then it's you, freshly from the oven. The process of the making was actually, I think, for personally, was a lot more interesting than perhaps just a final picture. And that's where I'm at the moment. I sense that this could be a new beginning of another way of making. I have other ideas already. Some of them are really big and scary. I need to work through them. Finally, a question for the audience. Right. The original Chinese title to add meter is Meter. It's American spelling. So one of my curator friends has already asked me, are you going to use the British spelling? Metre. I said, oh, I don't know. I thought I was going to be consistent to the original title, but she said, but if you change it, it also indicates a change of location. So that's our conversation this morning. So I'm going to stop there. And if you have questions, and please, tell me. I'm going to stop share.
Thank you, Jan. We are quite short of time. So what I would suggest is that you put your email in the chat if you're willing to do that, and people can get in touch with you directly, because I think there's so much in there, and actually so many questions about self-identity, about culture, about how we read landscape. There's so many things in there. We could talk about it for hours, I'm sure. But I will invite one question from somebody, anybody. If you'd simply like to unmute yourself and go ahead. Anybody want to come in?
Hi, Ian, this is Ben. Because I have a little insight into your adding a meter project. I know that you did a lot of video of the performance, and I wondered how you're planning to use that.
Yeah, that's a really good question, because that has to be really worked out very carefully, because I realize this is a very conceptual piece and the context is so important. So I'm still thinking about what goes in and what doesn't go in with the video. The video shows so much more richness of the process of making my involvement, the mutual respect and understanding of what the work was about among the 15 people who were involved in it. So yeah, I need to find some money to pay for our editor. But at the same time, I'm hoping to get it done soon enough. Thank you.
I'm very curious about. I can ask you separately because we're very short on time. But actually, I'm sorry. I won't say this now because I'll come back to you. But because there's a nice comment from Dennis O'Shea who says there's also the consideration of the poetic use of the word meter, which I think is a really interesting thing that you may not have thought about. Dennis, do you want to just quickly say anything about that?
Well, yeah, it was just it's just the use of the word, because poetic is sort of the rhythm of a poem. So you're talking about that, and there's a rhythm in the landscape. I was just kind of interested in the whole thing about the non-native, because I was doing my portfolio for NCAD in 2013, and I just was picked a small little copse of a small little woodland just north of Dublin, and in the end I didn't really know what to do, but in the end I sort of focused on the signs, because it was what they called an educational wood, whereby people would take classes to visit and learn about it. So there's all these sort of little signs saying insects and things like that. But of course, if the insects aren't there, the sign is just pointing to nothing. And then I found this sign which said non-native tree, and you're just looking at which tree is non-native, and they're growing in the soil, and you know, sort of you think, how long do you have to be growing in the soil to become a native? And there is sort of the Irish concept of being a blow-in in a village. So you're never really welcomed. You could be living there 40 years, but since you weren't born in the village, you're just a blow-in. So it's that whole idea of transplanting of species and the whole collecting of plants which went all around the world. And interestingly enough, a lot of plants, I mean, Ireland has a problem with rhododendron in Killarney, but a lot of plants from New Zealand thrive quite well in Ireland, and New Zealand is almost directly opposite us geographically. If you put a line straight through the centre of the earth, New Zealand isn't actually that far away from us. And, you know, it's just that whole idea of the colonial transporting of plants to other places and how it changes and modifies things, and ownership and labeling of plants and things like that. So they're just sort of ideas that, you know, just come to me. I have sort of a project which, you know, I will go back to, and, you know, I'm doing another thing at the moment on kind of like wasteland, or sort of that border between the city where it becomes the city and then it's the country, and where building has gone on in Dublin, partly from the Celtic Tiger and so on. So that's just ideas I had there, yeah, just suggestions.
Yeah, thank you, Dennis. We're going to move on, Evgenia, because we are a bit short on time, and I don't want to. We may go a little bit longer. Sorry, my phones keep ringing. I can't stop them. Evgenia, would you like to come in?
Yes, thank you so much. Well, first of all, thank you so much for this invitation, and thank you, Jan, for this really beautiful sharing. It's such a richness of work, and for me, a richness of thought and depths of you going there and really exploring. I also just want to acknowledge, I really appreciate the long time that you're taking to make all your projects. And for me, it's very special because I also work with long time, and I kind of feel very resonant on that. Yes. So I'd just like to share real quick where I am. I'm right now in Portugal, in Alentejo, so it's very south. And I'm in this wonderful place called Traditional Dream Factory. It's written there behind me. And it used to be an old chicken farm, which now is becoming a new co-living space, a community space, and hopefully a different kind of life here will be possible. And we are here at the summit, which has to do with regenerative cultures, regenerative villages practices, and yeah, basically everything regenerative, whatever it might mean for different people. And yeah, and so I'll start sharing something, but I'd also give you a little bit of context of how it all kind of fits together. Similar to Jan, how she drew parallel and gave context for her new work in the older work. So for me, it was really interesting to hear that. It made a lot of sense. So let me just share my screen for you. One second. Okay, I think you should be seeing my screen right now, correct?
We have it.
Okay, fantastic. So today I prepared for you a little bit of overview about a very particular project that I did called Say My Name and I Will Tell You My Story. It's quite specific. However, I'll put it in the context of the other work I've done, the previous work that I've been developing. But at the beginning, before I kind of dive deep into the slides, I'd like to read this quote for you from Monica Gagliano, who is a huge inspiration for me recently. At this crucial juncture in the evolutionary history of the planet and all living species, the circumstances are asking us to dream ourselves beyond the discordant format of a polarized reality and forward to more supportive futures, whatever these futures might be, which is what we are exploring. So the image that you are seeing on the screen right now is the actual exhibition that we did last year, and by we, I would like to acknowledge Inês Vale, who is a curator based out of Portugal, who has done her research in traditional Aboriginal painting in Australia, and she's also working a lot across Africa with African artists. So the project that we did, it was last year, and it was kind of developed already during COVID time, is mainly focusing on developing and kind of uprooting new possibilities, new narratives, and new stories around eucalyptus trees. And also going forward with this project, going towards engaging with indigenous voices and indigenous wisdom of what these trees might be communicating to us in various ways, and how it all fits into how we use these trees in our Western society. So the conceptual and the philosophical part we co-developed during series of conversations and series of walking in the actual eucalyptus plantations here in Portugal. And then I developed by myself in my studio a series of visual works together with the actual eucalyptus trees. But if we go a little bit backwards, in 2017, I moved to Portugal from London. I was in London for 10 years. I was based in the UK before. And as soon as I moved here, I started this project that is called Eternal Forest, which at the beginning was like an exploratory study to understand how is it happening that real biodiverse forests are almost erased everywhere in the whole of Iberia, specifically in Portugal, where I'm based. And I try to understand the motivation of people kind of planting monocultures instead of real forests and the basis for it. And so this whole process kind of took me around different communities, different villages. And in the last 4 years, I basically developed quite a large body of work, which encompasses different film installation, visual works, work that is around poetry and calligraphy. And now also in the last 2 years, a vision for creating physical eternal forest sanctuaries through art focused on biodiversity and community engagement. I'm not going to talk too much about this today because there's just not enough time, but I just wanted to give you this context and also mention and acknowledge that really I've developed this work for the last 4 years. I did not really consider myself to be anything like ecological artist before. It really all happened to me quite spontaneously. I believe it's like a calling that I heard from the land, from communities, and through all the kind of suffering that I've seen both in the land and around within communities of people. So imagine I'm learning and focusing and working through this idea of biodiversity and how we can bring creatively and proactively biodiversity into our lives. And then what happens is quite incredible. And I want to really share that with you because it means a lot to me. Basically, usually this is how the landscape typically looks in Portugal. So this is from one particular mountain called Monchique, looking down south towards the coast of Algarve. All of that you see, all these terraces, this is eucalyptus plantations. So it's incredibly depressing. It's very sad. It really impacts human psyche in a super kind of deeply negative way, I would say. These trees are used here in Portugal for production of paper for the whole of Europe. So Portugal is basically #1 producer of pulp for paper, for very cheap paper, toilet paper, printing paper, things like this. And the landscape is scarred from this development. This has been going on for about 70, 80 years. And these trees have been brought from Australia. However, where basically I started is pretty much seeing the aftermath of fires. And I was not really planning to touch the subject of eucalyptus. I was going directly, proactively thinking and inviting people to think about how we can co-create biodiverse natural spaces. But then what happened to me is I had a dream, and I had a dream of eucalyptus tree. And that was basically just before COVID happened, and in December, and the tree came to my dream as a sacred tree. And I was already a little bit used to that, because I used to have dreams of trees before, and I always know that it is a very strong communication. And the moment I woke up, I realized that it is not a simple dream, that actually tree is trying to communicate something. So I started kind of tuning in and started listening a bit deeper. What you see here on the images, you see cut eucalyptus, and on the right, you see a typical plantation that you can see everywhere. I have one around my house where I just go for a little walk. So from the very start, I haven't really looked at these trees as like invasive or bad trees. I was very neutral, but I wasn't really ready to jump on the train of actively working and collaborating with these trees. But then they started telling me more things, and their messages started to kind of seep through my psyche. And basically what happened is at some point I went and I sat with the trees. You can find some really big trees because the land was abandoned and they were left alone. And then from usual like small size that is used for paper, when the tree grows bigger, it can't be used for paper anymore, because the mechanics of the production is not used to these sizes. So once they're left alone, they grow as big as they grow in Australia, and they become these really, really gorgeous giants, which are bigger than pretty much any trees here in Portugal. So I sat with them and I said, well, look, why are you here? What do you want to communicate? And what is it that you want me to do? And the messages that I started hearing is that they're here to stay. We have brought them for our own purposes and for our own kind of selfish, solely extractive purposes, but they are not going away. And of course, we must figure out ways of collaborating with those species. And then I realized that the whole family, so eucalyptus tree is not a genus, as a family, and the whole family of these trees is talking to me. I started just seeing all the imagery from around the world. I started finding places I didn't know exist in Portugal, like a large-scale arbor. I think there is one person here on the call from a botanic garden or arboretum. So these places here, they are huge. We have 125 species in one particular place where you can go, and it's like squares, and you can track all these different species of eucalyptus when they blossom, and you can see different characteristics of the trees. And that's how they were first brought here, just to check out which tree is the most productive. And so then they figured out it's Eucalyptus globulus, which grows really fast, doesn't need to be looked after, produces paper after 15 years. Then you just cut them and you can replant them once again. So the question about this tree in Portugal is a taboo, is a real taboo. So it's either real hate, that this emotion that is caused by mentioning this tree, or people just really don't care. They just want money. They don't even know sometimes what happens on the land, because it's just all given to the companies. So I started connecting with these trees on a different level, and they told me that, well, why don't you just follow what we say step by step? Don't worry, you don't need to have a plan. And so my first initial step was just to go and to collect the matter that they drop on the ground, the leaves, the bark, and to start experimenting, because I heard that they have this amazing capacity inside with tannins. So I could use these tannins and I could use these materials to actually start some process and start printing things with these materials that they just offer kind of freely, and I don't even need to break any branches, because you can find all this matter on the ground. And I started seeing that the voice of the trees are coming through simply me interacting with these materials and figuring out the way to print with them. But of course, also a lot of parallel information was coming in, including information about what is the vision to use these trees internationally. Now they're also trying to genetically modify them and so on and so on. And trees are definitely wanting us to hear them as equals, to hear them as beings, not as objects. And so basically, I had to surrender to this whole process, and this was the first artwork I created. It's not that big, it's a small piece, it's on fabric. So basically the leaves are put directly on the treated fabric, and then the fabric is steamed, and then the piece is finished if you consider it to be finished, or you can just create several layers. So it's a very, very straightforward, typical botanical printing technique that's used by many artists, craftsmen all around the world. And then I started trying to kind of figure out and follow the natural patterns, how the actual leaves are if I put them on fabric. So all these artworks, they emerged in a totally spontaneous way, and most of them are first try. So it's just one-off piece, which is unique and which cannot really be repeated because of the different amount of tannin in every leaf that drops to the ground. And actually eucalyptus drops the leaves with tannins. So because the tannin has to go into the ground and through the root system, through the water, it will then return back to the tree through the roots. So the tannin actually also circulates in the system. So strange imagery started emerging, like the ones that you see here is a little bit reminding, I don't know what you see, but I see fire, and also fire and air, and sometimes it's like wings. So somehow the way the geometry of the leaves is in the final piece, it started kind of giving me this kind of dreamy visions of what the tree might be communicating. And of course, maybe it's just my projection, maybe it is coming from the trees, but basically the trees are associated with fire. I don't know if you heard about that, but the trees are full of these liquids, full of this oil. So they are incredibly flammable. And that is why we have such a big issue in countries where they're planted in monocultures, because where you have many of these trees, it becomes incredibly flammable. So here you can see some other examples of the artworks from the exhibition that we did last year. One of the things that really interests me in this project is this circularity, the cycle between life and death, the tree that is dropping the matter, and then how this matter can be reused in a more creative way, and how the cycle can be complete through artistic intervention. But also another aspect of it is looking at trees, land, rocks, rivers, mountains as animate subjects, as beings, rather than objects. So in this case, I was really trying to work with the being of the tree as an equal collaborator, rather than me always pushing the process. And sometimes something wouldn't work. Like this particular piece you can see in the background, I did a first attempt to work with leaves, but there was not enough tannins in the leaves, so the piece didn't come out so strongly. So what I did instead after is I used my typical calligraphic approach. I use a lot of Chinese or Japanese ink, And I use usually brush or other materials, but here I basically used leaves. I painted leaves and I stamped on top of this first piece. I stamped second piece, which is done in ink. And here you can see a little bit of a close-up. You can see it's done with ink. So there's another close-up. One of the important aspects that this project taught me and the eucalyptus tree taught me is reconnection with our dream space, really trusting ourselves on this intuitive journey throughout our life, and seeing how a lot of depths in life is really hidden in the dreams, and kind of how we are swiping away and kind of putting away this dream space because it's not rational, it's not practical, it's not efficient for us, and we're just constantly focusing on this just like productive relationship with ourselves, with nature, and with other species. So eucalyptus told me to really reconnect with my dream time and also to maybe embrace the fact that art is a spiritual practice, and when I can speak for myself, when I feel a calling, I must follow it. I have been resistant to directly talk about it for quite some time, but after working with Eternal Forest throughout the whole process and with this project, I realized that maybe it's something as an artist I can embrace rather than continue kind of pushing away from myself. Just a few other examples of the artwork. One more thing I wanted to mention, what was really interesting in this project, which again is not complete. Eucalyptus is telling me that I should continue slowly engaging with this tree and continue working, is the healing process. So throughout this few months of development of the work, the tree helped me to actually heal a physical ailment in my body by telling me how to use the leaves and in which sequence to do certain things, like take certain baths and take tea, and just simply tuning in with the, okay, I would say the spirit of the tree. And literally after the project was finished, that ailment was released, the pain was completely gone. So I'm forever grateful for this teaching. This is just an example of the process, how I'm working. So all the bark, when you pick up the bark, is really twisted, it's very strong. You have to straighten it. And I'm lucky because the summer period here is very long. So I can just use the sun and the water. I straighten the bark, then it dries. And then I have to put it back on the fabric and roll it really tightly. And then this whole big thing is basically steamed. Sometimes I steam it both ways because I haven't really built the big steamer. It's not done professionally. It was really done in a completely ad hoc situation. But I really enjoyed it because I think for me, it was also a huge lesson of trust, like really trusting the tree, really trusting the process, really trusting what was communicated to me, instead of as an artist knowing this is the outcome, this is what I want to do. So all the sizes, all the actual artwork that came together, it was a huge experiment. And what I liked about it is also how it all fits into generally my art, because I mainly, as I said before, work with calligraphy, and I do actually feel a little bit that calligraphic quality, like these were like these big strokes. But of course, if you start looking much closer, you see that these are the strokes that are made from the bark of the tree. So it's very, very, it has incredible texture that's imprinted forever in this fabric. So here you see some close-up examples. And this color that you see, it's also coming from the chemical treatment of the fabric and the steaming process. So it's natural cotton, but also originally it's white. And then of course it changes its color. So these are some more pictures from the exhibition. And also what we did and what I do with all my projects, because I think it's very important for us to communicate what we do to a larger audience. So we created a series of talks and conversations. This is just a poster for one of them. And we invited speakers that we felt could contribute to opening this discussion about the role and the place of the tree, and kind of trying to continue shifting this perception from the tree kind of being this hated object and this hated invasive species, to potentially rewriting this story, offering perhaps a space for the voice and the messages of this tree to come through. So we had this talk with Monica Gagliano and Sarah Abbott about plant intelligence and plant communication. We had a talk about eucalyptus indigenous knowledge from anthropologists from Australia, and a talk from two specialists, one actually on invasiveness of eucalyptus, called The Intangible Heritage of Forests. And I mean, the whole invasiveness of eucalyptus is a huge subject. So the bottom line is, I think personally, it's not an invasive species. I think we made it invasive. I think the way it's planted in monocultures in these dense linear rows, it creates incredibly negative impact on all sides of life, including the soil itself. But of course, unfortunately, the large-scale corporate, this massive giant industry, it has a lot of power, and it has very strong communication channels that with a lot of greenwashing, and it's much easier to make society believe that the species is invasive, as opposed to, well, maybe we need to change our practices from completely destructive and extractive to much more sustainable and regenerative. And just to give you one example, if you know anything about acacia tree, for example, and the presence of acacias in some parts of the world, acacias are really invasive. I mean, those guys propagate like really fast. In 1-2 years, they grow very high and they just keep going. So they expand, and the seeds that they drop, they're just waiting for the next fire. And then all the little saplings, they just, it's an explosion. Eucalyptus doesn't really do it. And if you have eucalyptus, which is just remaining there in between oak forests or local native species here in Portugal, they just grow as big trees. They take their space. For sure, they require more water, and we must respect that also. For sure, they like fire. We must also respect that. But like, we cannot change the nature and the character and the essence of the tree. We just must work with it. And so I just want to share with you this one extra slide where I try to describe what is it that I feel can be done. So I'd love to continue doing this research in Portugal and connecting to more specialists and looking, the more I look at the land, the more I look at plantations, and also how trees are when they're alone and where they are good members of the ecosystem. I understand them more. I can hear more of what they're trying to say. I am planning now a few immersive art experiences where eucalyptus are taking this really beautiful space, and they're also in kind of more groves where you have stratification and you have a lot of other species, so they're just not alone. It's not a monoculture. But also the trees invited me last year to think how we can create a strong bridge with the Aboriginal culture and invite Aboriginal voices, indigenous voices, to actually help us to figure out how we can regenerate land and regenerate our attitude in a more creative way. And of course, local scientists from Australia are more than welcome, and we keep connecting to these people, but also promote the awareness about biodiversity and value of biodiversity and effect of biodiversity on our culture versus monoculture. So basically shift the whole discourse from natives versus invasive to biodiversity versus monoculture, because it really changes the whole the whole perspective. And this is just one of the examples of, this is in Monsanto Forest Park, very close to Lisbon. It's one of the most incredible man-created local forests, and it has a really beautiful eucalyptus grove where, as I said before, it has a little bit of everything. It's not a monoculture. So I'm happy to share with you in the chat the video that we did about this exhibition, and also the website for Eternal Forest, where you can read more about like the larger project that I'm doing. And I think that's all more or less what I wanted to share with you. I hope it is enough to kind of activate some questions.
Evgenia, thank you so much. I let that run on because my poor timekeeping earlier meant that we were running a bit late. There's loads and loads of stuff in the chat. So, and I think there's questions for you to respond to, and you, Jan, as well. I will share that. I'll get this video edited and get it up online, certainly before Monday, and the chat will be there as well. So some of the talks and exhibitions that have been referenced, we'll also try to make sure we've got links to those as well. So I'm not going to open up for questions now because we've run over and I've let it run over, but thank you so much to both of you, to Jan and Evgenia. Two really interesting talks with actually so much that we could open a conversation about. I think we've got both emails now in the chat, and I think they're both on the website as well. So I'd encourage you to respond directly to the two artists. I certainly will, because I think there's a huge amount, and actually even the parallels between the two are really interesting and engaging. So thank you so much. I'm going to call it a day, and I'll say goodbye. And if everybody would like to just wave a thank you to Jan and Evgenia, thank you so much for being with us, and we will see you next time. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, everybody.
Bye. Bye-bye for now. Bye.